Hi everyone, so today I'm going to talk about Sionil Jose's Mass, which is part of the Rosales saga. It's the fifth one out of the Book of Five. So in Mass, the main character is Pepe Samson. He goes by Pepe, his real name is Jose Samson, and so he's the illegitimate son of Antonio Samson, who is the main character in The Pretenders. So the thing that's cool about Pepe Samson is that he is very he doesn't really care about anything or anyone. And it's very non-traditional to have a main character who's like this. I found him personally kind of really hard to like in the beginning because I'm like, oh man, like your family sacrifices so much for you to go to school and you can't even take your studies seriously. Like you're such a terrible child. And then I ask myself, why do I get to ask those questions, right? When Pepe's his own person. If he doesn't like school, he doesn't like school. School isn't for everybody. But with Pepe, his family sort of understands that his destiny is to be in school. And so he sort of struggles with that destiny in a lot of ways. He doesn't really see his destiny as school. He doesn't really understand why his mother is so hooked on this idea that he would succeed and become a writer and be a professor. In his mind, that's absolutely crazy. But he has this uncle, or as he knows as his uncle, named Tony Samson, who apparently was this really great scholar who traveled the world because he was such a great student. And he ends up doing his PhD in Harvard to come back to UP and become a professor. So it turns out that this uncle that he knows of is actually his dad, and that his mom, Emmy, and his dad, Antonio Samson, had an illegitimate affair. Well, they were cousins. And so, so the incest thing is kind of problematized a lot in the previous novel, but not so much in this one. He's sort of more concerned with feeling like an orphan and feeling like his father abandoned him and sort of referring to himself as a bastard a lot. And so there was a lot of self-searching in terms of figuring out how he felt about, being this son of this uncle who turns out was his dad. And it turns out it was a wealthy uncle who could have given him some opportunities to start off at a better rank in life. So he's very concerned with the idea of class. Though he's not really interested in politics, he's not really interested in school, he's not really interested in a lot of things except for reading novels and sort of reading philosophy and reading about food and reading about traveling. Aside from those things, those are his only passions, really. But there's one thing that he does have his heart set on. It's this idea that he doesn't like poverty. And so how he looks at Kabugawan village, which is the place that he's from, he sees it as sort of this place where people don't really progress, people don't really self-actualize, and in many ways it's sort of a living hell because you sort of are born one way and you sort of stay like that forever, and there's no change that happens within you because poverty is so rampant. So despite of the fact that he sort of sees his family as sort of coming from modest means or downright poverty, in comparison to the people that they live around, they're actually one of the few houses that has a bed, that has certain amenities that other people don't have. And that comes from the sacrifices that his mom makes, who's a seamstress, and his aunt makes, who's a school teacher. At some point, they send him to Manila. They send him to Manila to pursue a college degree. And so at this point, he's in his 20s because he's gotten left back so many times. And over there, you graduate when you're 16. So at this point, he goes to Manila. They give him 500 pesos. And they're like, hey, use this money to enroll in UP Diliman because that's your destiny. That's a place where you would succeed. But instead, he goes to Manila. He is so enthused to be around, like, amenities for the first time, so sort of like leisurely activities for the first time, and he spends the money on movies, on food, and sort of just exploring the city. By the time he gets to UP, he realizes that he doesn't have enough money. So when that happens, he tells his family that, the reason why I wasn't able to enroll in UP is because my grades didn't qualify, which was false. He just spent all the money for tuition. And so he ends up enrolling in a lower university called, like, in Recto. They refer to it as Recto. I'm personally not familiar with the university. And they sort of refer to it as a diploma mill. It's sort of a place where people go to just get the degree and get back to work and get a job, right? So while he's in Recto, on his first day, he meets this man, a fellow student named Augusto Salcedo. Augusto Salcedo, who goes by Toto. He is this acolyte for a priest in Tondo, and Toto is very, he has a very idealistic way of viewing the world, whereas Pepe is so much more, he's a lot more realistic, Pepe, but Toto sort of lives in this reality where he believes pretty much all the great things that people feed him within the Brotherhood, which is this nationalist movement that was brewing within the universities, and they were protesting the dictator, Marcos, who was about to become a dictator. They were protesting that. They were protesting American imperialism. And so these issues are really good issues to get behind. But in the context of the needs of the masses, which is the title of the book, which is Mass, it doesn't really necessarily address it. It seems like the movement is built for college students to perpetuate this idea of a movement. I mean, come to find out later, after this novel was published, 4 years later, was the People's Power Revolution, which removed Marcos from his dictatorship. But in this particular moment in time within the novel, the idea of a revolution is still sort of co-opted by the elite. And so that the evidence for that sort of presents itself throughout the novel, but let me not get carried away and let me stay with sort of the beginning of the novel. So he gets, has this friendship with Toto. They go out for merienda numerous times, which is like they grab snack together. And merienda is sort of this like social construction within the Philippines of a way to spend time with each other and bond with each other over food. It's like a snack time. It's like, think about recess. If recess had like a community aspect to it, that's kind of what merienda is. So Toto would always invite him for merienda. And Pepe would always notice like, oh, wow, he has money to like buy for Coke. He has money for this. And Pepe at this point in time, he's sort of like counting every penny. Like, you know, he's really just trying to get by. And so when Toto tells him, hey, you know, if you become part of the Brotherhood, you can really be something. Like, you have the personality, you have the looks, and people are naturally taken by you. So part of Pepe's charm is that he is a very likable person. He's funny, he's well-read, and he has a lot of opinions. He's very straightforward about them. And another thing is that he's been contemplating class and class differences since he was a kid, basically. And so these issues and ideas aren't new to him, and he's not regurgitating ideas. He's actually coming out with profound ideas and profound insights about Philippine society, especially from the perspective of somebody who has less than most people would in the universities. And so that's what makes him unique. And so he's immediately sort of elected to become class president. He delivers a speech that's very funny, very charming, and then he essentially writes this essay, what the youth must do for the nation, something like that, and he gets it published, and it does really well, and it's really well received. And this professor, who's the leader of the Brotherhood, Professor Hortenso, takes a liking to him. And another person who also takes a liking to him is this man named Juan Panetta. He sees that he has very good insights, that he's a very charming character, and essentially a lot of people sort of have this understanding that he's somebody who would be really well served in the political arena if he chooses to go down that path. So he at first resists this, and he tries to do sort of an illegitimate way of making money, which was something that was promised to him would make him 1,000 pesos in a month, which is more money than he's ever seen in his life. There's this neighbor named Kuya Nick. Kuya means just like older brother. It's like a way of referring to somebody who, you don't really know, but like is a way of like, attributing respect to somebody who's older than you, a little older than you. And so Kuya Nick is sort of this man who's always driving a nice car. He always has like nice watch on. He obviously like has some money compared to most people who live in Antipolo. And he has his mistress living next door to Pepe. So in the beginning, Pepe starts a relationship or loses his virginity to Manong Bert and Auntie Betty's maid. She's this Ilocana who came to try to like put her sibling through school. So this woman named Lucy, she is somebody who he's very taken with. He not only loses his virginity to him, but he also holds some resentment that Lucy is clearly seeing someone else. So while him and Lucy would be intimate in a certain bedroom, Kuya Nick and his mistress, apparently there's a hole in the wall, has been watching them. So now the mistress, I want to say her name is Maya, but I don't want to make it up. The mistress takes a liking to him because of the things that she sees through the wall and sort of ends up pursuing Pepe sort of like in a very shameless way. But Pepe, knowing that Kuya Nick is who he is, that he has some illegitimate connections, that he's not somebody to be crossed, sort of turns down all the advances and focuses on his studies. But however, Kuya Nick one day sees him and sort of propositions him and says, you can make a lot of money if you were enrolled in La Salle or Ateneo, which is like the good schools. Think of like Harvard and Yale. If you were enrolled in something like that, you would be able to expand our customer base. And so in the beginning, Pepe is sort of like, okay, like I'll make a lot of money, but what do I have to do? And he's like, oh, all you have to do is like make deliveries. It's no big deal. So Pepe tries this out for a week. He decides, okay, like I don't want to be in a brotherhood because I don't want to deal with politics. But if I can make money outside of school, that's something that would really appeal to me. And so he goes and he tells Kuya Nick that he's going to do it. He does this drug dealing thing for about a week. He lasts about a week because essentially during his drug dealing, he starts talking to the customers. And then one day he has this pretty customer named Doris. And Doris is sort of telling him, hey, like the product is not for me. It's actually for my friend. She's addicted and I'm just trying to be a good friend and eventually tell our parents to like wean her off the drugs. And Pepe's like, yeah, you should absolutely tell your parents. And then Doris is like, but then you'd lose a very loyal customer. And he's just like, well, then there will be more. Like, I guess that's just like part of the course of like this sort of business. And so Doris finds that very sort of attractive and there's some tension between them, but it's something that Pepe doesn't entertain. Because in his mind, she obviously comes from like a higher class and is not someone I should be fraternizing with. So the reason he stops doing the drug dealing is because after the Doris affair, he has another customer who tells him to get in the Lincoln, which is like to get in his car. And he, for some reason, listens to him. And the guy was so whacked out on heroin that he essentially drives the car all the way to like an embankment and like bumps into a tree. And because he wasn't able to defend himself in that particular moment, he enrolls himself in karate in order to learn how to fight, like self-defense, and also how to learn how to discipline himself. And so on his spare time, when he's not in school, he would be in karate learning how to fight. So after spending some time practicing karate and learning about the art form, he gets really good at it. And around this time, his Aunt Bettina from Kabugawan village visits to try to process her raise with the Department of Education. They used to have the system where in order for you to get a raise, you had to process it in Manila. And so Auntie Bettina is staying at Aunt Betty and Manong Bert's house. and they have a conversation, right? And so Pepe reveals that he's come to the realization from his conversations with Manong Bert and Auntie Betty that Tony Samson is his father, and that his mother had a legitimate affair with him because they were cousins who sort of had him out of wedlock. And Aunt Bettina was like, well, this is why we knew that your future was so secured, because he was a great scholar. He wrote a lot about nationalist movements, and he's a great man. Like, don't resent him. Don't resent Tony. Tony did what he believed was best. At this point, this idea of him becoming a writer is something that he's sort of resisting. He's like resisting this destiny, right? At some point, his friend Toto sort of encourages him to apply for the managing editorial position at the newspaper in his school. And so he submits that essay that got published, and it does really well, and it gains him the managing editorial role. And so now he's head of the newspaper, and the Professor Hortenzo, who was really taking a liking to him, sort of invites him and Toto to his house to have a toast over whiskey for his achievement, and also talk to him about joining the Brotherhood more seriously. So while they're in Professor Hortenso's house, his wife sort of jokes with him and says, hey, don't ever be a writer, because if you're going to be a writer, your wife is going to starve. And so Pepe sort of jokes about this, and he says, like, I will never marry, so don't worry about it. When he comes home that evening, after like the good celebration with him getting the managing editorial role, he finds out that the woman that he's like sort of in love with, who he lost his virginity to, the help of the household, has been having an affair with his Uncle Bert under Auntie Betty's nose. So it's sort of this like very strange turning point in the novel, because how it's revealed is sort of like, okay, Lucy, are you seeing someone else? Like, it's clear to me that you're seeing someone else. What does he have that I don't have? Is it money? And Lucy's just quiet, and he's like, well, does he give you money? And he's like, yeah, it's your Uncle Bert, and he gives me money. So another thing that also happens within that chapter is that he later on reveals, Pepe later on tells Toto that, like, hey, Toto, like, I actually don't believe any of the things I wrote. It's crazy to me how, like, I even got selected. I don't believe any of that. I just believe in, like, making sure and securing my future. And that sort of foreshadows the rest of the novel, this idea of lying to get ahead, because it's something that he understands from his own survival mechanism is necessary to get ahead. But once he sees it in the face of an elite trying to get ahead through lies, it's something that he has such a cognitive dissonance with, to a point where he does something that he's not supposed to do. So at some point they have like a flashback to a point where he had a dog named Pugot. Pugot was his dog, who was like an old black Cocker Spaniel. And it belonged to a co-teacher of Auntie Bettina, but he was going away to the United States, so he sort of left the dog. So Pepe really loved this dog. He named him Pugot, and they would like hang out together and sleep under the house together. But one day the mayor's wife comes in, sees the dog, and like realizes it's an all black dog and takes a liking to the dog. So the next day the mayor comes, and the mayor is like, we'll give you 30 pesos for the dog, just give us the dog. And he's just like, no, like, that's terrible, like, I love this dog. And the mayor was just like, we'll give you 30 pesos, or I can also just pursue your mother, who's a seamstress, who has been operating her business without a license and not paying her taxes, and essentially you guys will get taxed. And there was a lot of headache with it, that the mom was like, you know what, just give up the dog, I'm sorry. And the mayor sort of has the audacity to invite Pepe to come see what they're going to do with the dog, because Pepe was curious, like, what are you guys going to do with my dog? Like, why is this so important to you? That you'd pay 30 pesos for it, which like over there was like a huge sum for that time. And then it turns out there was like an abulario, which is like a witch doctor, who was waiting for them to arrive with the dog. And so when the dog had arrived, this is like the most gruesome part. They essentially slit the dog's throat and fed the blood to the mayor's wife so that it would cure her of her asthma. At least that was the belief. And the next day, she was so happy that she would finally be cured with her asthma that she goes to Emmy, who's Pepe's mom, and tells her, hey, I want 3 dresses for this and this event. And turns out she didn't even live to see when those dresses were complete because she had died from consuming the dog's blood raw. So the overarching chapter for this scene with the dog is sort of the flashback with the dog is sort of juxtaposed to his present. And in his present, he gets propositioned by Kuya Nick to essentially have sex with his mistress while politicians and high-moneyed people are watching through a two-way mirror. And so he, outside of his normal instincts, because of the offer of money and because it was such a huge sum, he decided that he was going to do it. And so he had sex with the mistress while people were watching through a two-way mirror. And that whole chapter is called The Litany of Slavery. And so it sort of shows you that he finds himself in many instances where he doesn't have a choice but to give up his freedom or his will for the sake of money because he comes from poverty. And that's actually like the saddest part of the novel, is the truism in that, right? Like so many times when you come from a modest background, you are sort of inclined to not really pursue the things that you would have rather pursued in a legitimate space. You kind of are forced to be submitted to illegitimate activities that would sort of give you the monetary incentive to get ahead. And so after that moment when he has sex with the mistress through the two-way mirror, that's sort of where he like has this like eureka moment that I'm going to take my studies seriously and the brotherhood seriously, because it's a better path to lie than to subject myself to the will and power of people who have more than me outside of the spaces of academia, because then I'd be forced to do things like this. So with all his internal ruminations in terms of deciphering where he fits in the larger social class demarcations, he decides that the things that was happening to him in Antipolo, always like being at the mercy of the political will or the political will of people who have more than him, he sort of takes his social existence and thinks to himself, okay, like what are my options here? And so Toto, his best friend, sort of offers him an option and says, hey, you can be an acolyte with me at the convent. And, Father Jess is really nice. He would love you. He would be more than open to taking you in. And so this convent happens to be located in Tondo, which is a very poor area. It is said that Bonifacio's Katipunan was founded here. A lot of academics and politicians sort of come to this area to sort of rally the masses and deliver beautiful speeches that they never deliver on. And it's a place that's actually very devastating in the amount of poverty and how rampant poverty is. So they've been trying to get a basketball court cemented. And Father Jess, who's the priest, by the way, he's a priest who became a priest not out of necessity, but out of guilt. Like his family is a rich, wealthy family of sugar planters. And he sort of is the black sheep of his family who decided to go into the service at the convent to become a priest. And there's something that he says later on where he talks about sort of the challenges with priesthood is not within the lack of sex, but more so in the in the will to being obedient when there are things that you don't necessarily agree with. And so that's a character aspect about Father Jess. That's something that is very critical with how he accepts the news that that Pepe delivers to him later. So in Tondo, there's a gang called the Tayo Tayo Gang, which is led by this guy named Roger, and he is very sort of hard to deal with. A lot of the alleviation efforts that they try to enforce within Tondo, he sort of always undermines it. He is kind of like a wayward sort of like Siga. I don't really know how to, like a bully. Everyone sort of sees him as a bully, and he sort of navigates the space within Tondo as if it was a prison in itself. Turns out later on it's revealed that he has been in prison in Muntinlupa, and the ethics of the Tayo Tayo gang actually come from the prison codes that they had when they were incarcerated. They have a set of rules that they abide by that they bring with them to Tondo. So part of his impossible nature of why he's so hard to deal with, he's sort of like always hanging out and drinking all day with his friends and looking really tough, like they have tattoos and stuff like that. The reason that they're so approachable is because they're bringing those prison codes or those prison mores into Tondo, and they sort of treat it like a prison in itself because it's so dilapidated and has such a lack of opportunity, which is really sad. Sorry. So Lily is this woman who Toto has a crush on. Lily had gotten pregnant by an American Peace Corps volunteer who was staying in Tondo. And after she had the baby, because she didn't have enough money to buy medicine, the baby essentially died. But by this time, the American Peace Corps volunteer sort of goes back to the States and sort of loses touch with her. And there's a discussion during this section about how American citizenship is regarded, or rather how the ways of dating a foreigner is sort of has this like hidden implication that if you date a foreigner, it's sort of a key into a better life. It's sort of a key into a possibility of becoming an American citizen, which means leaving the life of Tondo and leaving poverty. Granted, you won't be rich in America. I mean, unless you were really lucky and you got a rich person. But they were saying how like a lot of rich women within Manila are sort of deterred from dating foreigners because they don't want to be stereotyped as one of these girls who sort of seduces an American to get an American visa. But in the same vein, it's sort of like a post-colonial symptom, right? This like idealization of the former oppressor, and it's something that's very real within the context of dating in Philippine society. I mean, from my observation, correct me if I'm wrong, but the key to it, or like the spirit for the phenomenon, or why it happens, is because when you live in an area where there is a lack of opportunity and there's rampant poverty, marrying up is considered marrying out is considered marrying up. So marrying to go to a place like the United States is considered marrying up, and is a better sort of social safety net for yourself and your family. So that was also an interesting sort of detour within the story, this interrogation of Filipino dating habits or Filipino American dating habits, and sort of the stereotypes and the various connotations of it. If you're poor, it's seen as something that's good. If you're rich in the Philippines, it's sort of seen as something that could potentially be seen as bad. So I thought that was very interesting, and also very, like, completely antithetical to the sentiments of mass movements at that time, which is like Yankee go home, close the US bases, down with imperialism. But when it comes to the areas of, it kind of harkens back actually to the Pretenders, when Tony Samson's friends sort of like laugh at him and say, hey, the surest way out of poverty in your case seems to be through sex. Ha ha ha. It's a political weapon. But in many ways, that's a reality for a lot of people who don't have a lot of options. And it's a sad reality, and it's a true one that we don't interrogate because there's an economic implication to it. And so a lot of the things that make Pepe very unique is that because he's so fixated with money and the distribution of money, he is very quick to sort of recognize when economy trumps idealism, right? And so a lot of the debates that he's had within the Brotherhood, when people would say things like down with the imperialism, down with US imperialism, he's like, well, wait a minute. Like, if you were to think about it, the companies that offer better pay are American companies compared to Filipino companies. And if I personally had to choose, I would choose American companies because they'll pay me better. That's not anything to do with idealism. That's not anything to do with ideology. It's just pure survival. And a lot of people, the mass of people, are in survival mode. Speaking of survival mode, at this point, the Brotherhood has led another demonstration. They want to do a demonstration, which is like a series of protests, nationalist protests in the name of nationalism and freedom. But what they're not really saying is that the real, and this is something that Kalusha, who's a former Hakbalahap, who was like a revolutionary against the Japanese, he says, like, this isn't the time for a revolution. What are you guys even saying? Because your enemy is within the Philippines this time. It's a little different. So you're sort of using the US as a scapegoat when the real problems right now is that the oligarchy within the Philippines have so much hold over the masses, and that the masses are only getting crumbs. So the Brotherhood holds another demonstration or series of protests against US imperialism. And all of a sudden, the protest is tear gas and like a rain of fire, of bullets, just like they're basically attacked. And it's neither the police nor the military. It's sort of an unknown faction, but ultimately they sort of scapegoat the police and the military, how it's covered, how I understood it was told in the novel. But it was actually a secret faction who had led the violence against the protest. And so Toto, who is Pepe's best friend, gets hit, and he essentially dies from his wounds. So when Toto dies, it's sort of like a huge wake-up call for Pepe, and he sort of doubles down on like his role within the Brotherhood as a form of protection. So he gets really good grades the following, that semester he gets really good grades, and his tuition is sort of guaranteed to be for free for the next semester because of how good his grades is. And on top of that, he's sort of ascending the ladders of the Brotherhood. And so he gets invited to a getaway in Tagaytay with a bunch of students from La Salle, Ateneo, and all those big schools. And the Brotherhood is sort of leading this retreat for them. And so while he's there at the retreat, the woman that he met earlier named Doris, while he was pushing drugs, is there. And turns out her name is actually Betsy. And guess what? Betsy is very rich and is actually Nina de Jesus and Ben de Jesus's daughter. And she invites Pepe to a birthday party, I want to say, at Pobres Park, which is where she lives. So she invites him, and Pepe is like dressed up all nice. He has his long hair like, you know, slicked back, and he's dressed in a barong, and he looks ready to party. And when Betsy's parents arrived, they start speaking to him in Spanish. And when he couldn't respond in Spanish, it sort of revealed his social class, that he was not like among them. And so this moment really devastates Pepe. It makes him very angry. But who's even angrier is Ben de Jesus and Nina de Jesus. They sort of talk to their daughter and basically say, like, you got to stay away from him. It seems like you like him. And ultimately, they decide to send her away to New York. But Betsy actually falls in love with Pepe. And Pepe, for a really long time, like, as he's reading posters, like, down with the bourgeoisie, down with this, down with that, like, he just had a hard time seeing the bourgeoisie as his enemy because of Betsy. And so he has some sort of cognitive dissonance with that for a really long time. But in the same vein, he goes out of his way to learn Spanish because it's something that they really look down on him upon. And he essentially takes a lot of Spanish classes. Turns out that Tia Nena, who is the help of the priest, Father Jess, turns out she is also a Spanish-speaking person. So he had somebody within the convent that he could practice his Spanish with. So at some point in the novel, his mother dies. And when his mother dies, Father Jess goes with them to Kabugawan village, and they bury his mom. And his mom essentially leaves a letter saying for certain that, you know, his dad is Antonio Samson. And Antonio Samson is sort of like this highly regarded mind within the UP campus and within colleges in general. A lot of people read his work in terms of people who are interested in nationalist movements. He does a lot of nationalist writing, and a lot of people regularly cite him. In fact, Betsy, who is this girl who's in love with him, is essentially really into Antonio Samson, Tony Sampson's writings. And at some point he had to reveal to her that, like, Tony Sampson is my dad. And it's like this really intense moment because it happens in a cafe. And while Betsy is sort of saying all these great things about Tony Sampson, he still harbors a lot of anger towards his father for having the life that he has, because his father had married into the bourgeoisie, essentially married into the villa family. But then he ends up killing himself because he couldn't live amongst the rich. And so after he kills himself, his wife slowly deteriorates and actually goes insane and eventually dies. And so Betsy's parents sort of see Pepe as like, okay, like, if Tony Sampson is his dad, like, he just carries and harbors bad luck. It's genetic. Like, he will bring bad luck to our child. We need to send her away. So they send Betsy away. So at some point, they go to Professor Hortenso's house because different chapters of the Brotherhood amongst all the universities were going to meet at Juan Panetta's. Juan Panetta is this really wealthy man who is supporting the Brotherhood movements in all the campuses. And so Betsy and Professor Hortenso's wife were initially just saying how they don't necessarily trust Juan Panetta. And at some point, you know, Pepe doesn't really believe it. They're like, oh, he's such a good guy. He funds everything that we do within the Brotherhood. But then his friend Lily, who started working at a massage parlor, one day tells him, hey, like, I've seen him in the massage parlors. Like, he is a regular customer and he doesn't necessarily ask for sexual favors. He just looks at the men a lot. And then in Pepe's mind, he was just like, that's ridiculous. Like, he's such a manly man. Like, he is such a... like, he's good looking, he's rich, and he's married. Like, obviously, that must be the wrong person that you're talking about. So they go to Juan Panetta's office, the people in the Brotherhood. And once they get there, they engage in conversation, right? And so Juan Panetta at this point takes a real liking into Pepe Samson, because Pepe, they started talking about like dismantling the oligarchic rule in the Philippines and sort of the future trade, like the future of trade within a globalized reality, right? Like the world was changing at that point and things were increasingly becoming globalized, and Americans essentially had the hegemony. And like what's the plan here if we're saying like down with the US, down with the oligarchy? I mean, what does that, like, how does that feed the masses? Like, what do the masses get out of something like that when they're just trying to survive, right? They need to have food in their bellies, and they need things to survive, education, healthcare, and food. These are the things that they care about. What does down with imperialism mean to somebody who is starving and needs food? So he says, like, if you want to organize the masses, you start with addressing their needs. And beautiful speeches don't just do that. So at some point, Betsy sort of like interjects and says, you know, like, you seem like you have like such a strong opinion about poverty. There's integrity in poverty. And Pepe is like, I've lived through poverty and there's nothing romantic about it. There's nothing, there's no integrity within it. Like, you essentially, as a poor person, have to do what you need to do to survive. And he was speaking from experience when he said that. And so after he reveals this in the moment, Juan Panetta sort of like really becomes interested in him, as, I mean, I don't have to reveal it later. So essentially Juan Panetta is an informant. He works for some sort of faction within the elite that has been going to universities and sowing chaos and sort of sowing false hope with these mass movements, because it was led by the elite so that the elite can undermine the movement. So it's like counter-revolutionary within a revolutionary framework. And so Juan Panetta reveals later, when he takes Pepe to his house and tries to preposition him for sex, and Pepe was like, like not very interested. He gets a phone call. Juan Panetta gets a phone call and says, hey, you know, like, I need to take this phone call in the bedroom, so I'll be right back. So meanwhile, it was just Pepe and Juan Panetta, like the maids had the day off and the wife was out somewhere with the kids. They were visiting their grandma. And so when he takes the call again from this like nervous sounding guy who I'm assuming was an informant, Pepe sort of listens in on the other line. At this point, he has learned Spanish, so he speaks Spanish fluently. And the guy was essentially like, who are you with? And he's like, oh, just some stupid kid from the villages. And Pepe was just like, oh, okay. And then the guy essentially was like, okay, is like everything in place for the January protests? Like the violence that's going to happen? Like, are we prepared? And he's like, yeah, we're prepared. And they essentially talked about how, you know, that they were funding these violence in the protests, and things started really connecting for Pepe. And Pepe was just like, wow, so this man that I had trusted, who has been giving money to the Brotherhood, which is the series of mass movements that were happening throughout the various campuses within Manila, is also the same person that's been attacking the violence. And so when he reveals that, Pepe gets so upset that he shoots him in the heart, in the chest, and he dies. And so, sorry, I mean, I should probably deliver that with more anger or something. And so he dies, and I mean, serves him right. What Pepe does is Pepe sort of goes through his money, takes half, goes through the jewelry, takes half, essentially ensures that he doesn't leave any evidence of his presence within the residence, and also just like steals a bunch of things and leaves. Towards the end of the novel, he tells Father Jess that he had shot Panetta, and Father Jess was like, we don't shoot people for being homosexuals. And he's like, I didn't shoot him because he was a homosexual. I shot him because he's responsible for Toto's death. Like, he's responsible for the violence that took away my best friend. And so that's essentially how the novel ends. It sort of ends with him going back to Kabugawan village, which is sort of an interesting circle because he comes from denouncing the place of his origin to essentially finding refuge in it. And Betsy gets sent to New York. Betsy actually proposes to him. Sorry, it's like one of the details in the novel that I didn't think was that important. I mean, she proposes to him, sort of like loses her mind about like staying with him. And he was just like, no, you're rich. Just go be rich and leave me alone. It's a lot to contemplate. And I thought about sort of the decisions that Pepe made that I personally wouldn't have made. But that's the beauty of the novel, I think, is that it takes people who come from similar backgrounds like Pepe, like I do, and sort of presents you in situations to sort of assess which path you would take. So for me personally, I chose the traditional path. I went to academia, like graduated, got all these degrees, and then try to, create my own freedom through my writing and through my profession. I understand that that would have taken Pepe a longer amount of time, and I sometimes do have some setbacks that make me ponder whether or not I should have went straight into the workforce instead of getting 2 masters, because the path of academia was something that I really wanted for myself. But I just simply crumbled. I thought it was too hard. But Pepe is tough, I think he would have survived academia, and I think he would have survived politics. I think he could have had a little bit more patience in realizing his goals. But a lot of people would argue that asking people who have had a lifetime of being oppressed to be more patient about their oppression is also not the right way, right? Like, if you want a revolution, sometimes you have to take it upon your own self. I personally would not go around murdering people who come from power, but that's what Pepe chose. And I think what the novel is trying to do is to sort of teach us the lesson that no matter what, patience is key and violence is not something that will get you towards the goals that you want, right? Because now he's going back to Kabugawan, is essentially back to where he started. So all his efforts are just going to be cast to the wind. And what if he married Betsy? What if he married Betsy and found a life through there? And then he would have repeated in the footsteps of his father, and he would know better not to commit suicide, but to use the situation for what it is. I think that sometimes when we get trapped in our moral absolutes, we forget that there are ways to move our own agenda forward. And sometimes we just have to be a little bit patient if we come from less. But maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I see it.